Welcome to my video tutorial on how to crochet double crochet granny squares into an afghan. I'm not going to review how to crochet the granny squares. For that lesson you can refer back to my previous video on how to crochet a granny square. In this video I'm going to go over how to crochet the granny squares into an afghan. We're going to review how to crochet the rows, how to crochet the columns, and how to crochet the edges of your afghan. Let's get started. I organize my granny squares before I crochet my rows. I create stacks that represent each row, and the number of granny squares in each stack represent my columns. On the screen I have 4 stacks of 4 granny squares because I plan to crochet an afghan that consists of 4 rows and 4 columns. I'm going to start with row 1, so I'm going to take 3 granny squares off of each stack and set them off to the side. To crochet my rows together, I'm going to start working through a half row. I'm going to crochet always from right to left because I'm right-handed. If you're left-handed, you can follow the mirror image of what I'm going to do. So on screen I have 4 granny squares laid out, and now let me demonstrate the pattern down the rows. I'm going to begin my row pattern in the upper right corner of a square. I'm going to start by joining my yarn into that upper right corner. As before, first capturing both the tail and the working end, and then subsequently just the working end. I'm going to chain 3, and then the pattern, it calls for 2 double crochets in that corner. That chain 3 will act as a double crochet. I'm going to chain 1, and then the pattern repeats down the chain 1 spaces. In each chain 1 space, I'm going to do 3 double crochets, chain 1, going back to the next chain 1 space, working 3 double crochets. Chain 1. And you can repeat that pattern down your granny square, working 3 double crochets in each chain 1 space, and 1 chain to bring you to the next chain 1 space. When you get to a corner, you're going to do 3 double crochets in that corner, Now that you've worked down 1 granny square, you need to connect in the next granny square. In between our granny squares, we're going to do 2 chains. And now the pattern to begin the next granny square is in the upper right corner of the square. We're going to do 3 double crochets. Not the chain 3 since the yarn already is working down the rows. Chain 1, and you can continue to work that pattern down the rows. I've crocheted down a half of my first row and I finished with my chain 2, and I now need to turn my work, so again I'm working in the upper right corner of my next square. Once I lay out my row so there's no twists in the chain 2 spaces, I'm going to simply rotate my entire row . So my working end is here on the right, and I'm going to work my crochet pattern down, again crocheting in the upper right corner of my first square. Working down the second half of our rows will be almost the identical pattern as the first half, but we need to make sure to capture the chain 1 spaces and the chain 2 spaces of our first half. Here in my first corner, I'm going to do 3 double crochets . Now I need to do a chain 1 space, and that chain 1 space needs to capture the chain from the previous row. So I'm going to insert my hook into the chain 1 space from the last half a row, and I'm going to chain 1. So I'm going to yarn over and pull through, and then I'm going to work 3 double crochets in the next chain 1 space. Here's my chain 1, so I need to capture the chain 1 from the previous row, or the previous half row, and then work 3 double crochets in the next chain 1 space. Keep working down that pattern until you get to a corner. Then in a corner, you're going to do 3 double crochets, and you want to do a chain 2 to bring you to the next granny square. So let's chain 1. And we want to join it into the chain 2 space. So you're going to insert your hook under the chain 2 space, and then chain 1, and now you can work the pattern down, working 3 double crochets, chain 1, 3 double crochets down the next granny square, and then doing 2 chains on the edge of the granny squares. The end of our rows are going to be a little different than the previous part of our rows, because we need to create a chain 2 space. So let's chain 2, and we'll finish the row with a slip stitch into the top of the chain 3. At this point, we can cut our yarn. Weave in the loose end now or at the end of our project. Notice when you finish row 1 that you're ready to begin row 2 in the upper right corner of the square. So you can go ahead and crochet your rows, and when you're ready, revisit the video to begin the columns. You'll notice when you finish the rows that the row pattern is resembling the pattern from the granny square. And when we crochet the columns, we're going to fill in the gaps between the squares. So once you finish the rows, you need to rotate your work 90 degrees. rotating the entire afghan. So again, to begin the column, you're going to begin in the upper right corner of a square. The pattern for the column is going to be almost identical to the pattern for the rows, with the biggest change being how to connect the rows to the columns. So let me begin with the first column and work through a couple squares so you understand that change. Again, we're going to begin by chaining 3 in the upper right corner of a square. Working 2 more double crochets into that corner. And between the chain 1 spaces, I chain 1, and then I'm going to 3 double crochets into the chain 1 space. Chain 1, that pattern repeats down to the corner. And in the corner, I'm going to crochet the other part of this corner. So after I chain 1, I'm going to do 3 double crochets in that corner. And then I need to connect my columns to my rows. With the chain 2. So let me put my hook behind the chain 2 space from the rows, and then I'm going to chain once and twice. And then I begin crochet the other part of this corner. So chain or 3 double crochets, chain 1, following that pattern down this granny square to the corner, and let me demonstrate the corner connecting the columns to the rows one more time. Let's do 3 double crochets in the corner to do the other part of the corner. Then let's chain 2, making sure to capture the rows to bring ourselves to the next granny square. So I'm going to insert my hook under the chain 2 space from the rows, and then I'll chain 1, 2, and that'll set me up to do the pattern in the subsequent granny square. Our columns finish with chaining 2, and then we need to again turn our afghan, turning it 180 degrees. So we can work down our columns, again beginning with the upper right corner of a square. Our pattern working down the columns are going to be again almost the same as the rows, but we need to make sure to capture the rows when we get to them. So let's begin working down the columns, and I'll demonstrate just the first granny square. So we've chained 2, and then we're going to do 3 double crochets into the corner. Which will create the first half of this corner. And in between, we need to capture the chain 1 space from the last way down. So I'm going to go under it, chain 1, and then do 3 double crochets into the next chain 1 space. And chain 1, making sure to capture the chain 1 from the way down. And you'll repeat that pattern down your granny square until you make it to the corner. I'll repeat the corners one more time. After we chain 1, capturing the last part of the column, we're going to do 3 double crochets in the corner of our granny square. And then do a chain 2, capturing the rows and the columns. So once I've done my 3 double crochets, I'm going to go under the rows, chain 1, chain 2, and work the pattern into my next granny square. 3 double crochets, chain 1, down the granny squares to finish the columns. We'll finish each column by chaining 2 and slip stitching into the top of the chain 3 that started our column. At that point, we can weave in the loose ends. We're going to put a border around our afghan when we finish the columns and rows. So we're going to begin by joining our yarn into one corner. We'll chain 3 and then work our first corner pattern. So we'll do 2 double crochets into the corner, chain 2 to create the corner, and then work 3 more double crochets into the corner. We'll chain 1 and then we'll work the pattern down the edge. So our pattern down the edge of our afghan will be to do a cluster of 3 double crochets in a chain 1 space, chain 1, work that pattern down each square, doing that same pattern in the corner of our square. As well as that chain 2 space that we created when we finished or turned the rows and columns. So we're going to repeat that pattern down each side, doing cluster of 3 double crochets, chain 1 down the side until we get to a corner. Then we'll do our next quarter pattern. So we're going to do a cluster of 3 double crochets, We'll chain 2, and then we'll turn our work 90 degrees. Do another cluster of 3 double crochets. We'll chain 1 and then work the pattern around our afghan along each of the edges. The final step in our afghan will be to do a slip stitch into the top of the chain 3 that started our border. And after that, we can weave in all the loose ends. That concludes my video tutorial on how to crochet a double crochet afghan pattern. Feel free to review any of the timestamps in the description below, and feel free to leave any comments or questions about the pattern.